Hi everyone, my name is Emma Kiddle and I'm a publisher for the Earth and Environmental Science book list at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. So thank you all for joining this webinar for exciting new textbook, Earth History, Stories of Our Geological Past, by Peter Copeland, Professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Houston, and Janok Bhattacharya, the Susan Cunningham Research Chair in Geology at McMaster University in Canada. So this textbook is aimed primarily at first and second year courses on Earth history and historical geology, including those with no prerequisites. And a key aim of the book is to provide a more engaging text for these courses by focusing in on some key events in Earth history and using a narrative style to tell the story of how geologists have used multiple strands of evidence from different subdisciplines to build up an understanding of each event. And along the way, the authors introduced essential concepts in geology. I've had the pleasure of working closely with the authors over the last few years as they've developed the book, and I'm really excited that we're now nearing publication, which is scheduled for the 1st of May. And I'm delighted that the authors can join us today to tell us more about the book. So let's start off with some questions. Pete, I'll address the first question to you. What inspired you to write the book?
Thanks, and good morning to everyone. Well, in my first part of my career, I taught physical geology here at U of H. I looked it up. I've taught it several dozen times. But after a lot of that, and after some retirements here at U of H, it was requested that I start teaching the historical, and I was keen to do that. And I did it for a few years, using the text that we had already been using. And I found that I kept changing my presentation to the class. I was adding things, I was changing around, I was leaving stuff out. And after a while, I realized that what I was really trying to do was tell stories to the students that they were interested in. And I felt like the problem with the book that we had, and this goes with many books for physical and historical geology, is they tend to be a kind of bunch of lists. Even in historical geology, you'll get somebody who'll say, this is what North America looked like in the Cambrian, and this is what it looked like in the Ordovician, and this is what it looked like in the Silurian. And it was just sort of this dutiful recitation of things as they came along. But I realized that when you're, all of us geologists, when we've been at a party, or, you meet somebody at an airplane or somewhere, they say, you're a geologist. Oh, and, if they're at all interested, they don't sort of say, please tell me about the 3 kinds of plate boundaries. They want to know about something they've heard, some story they've heard. Is California going to fall into the sea, or are we going to run out of oil, or why is Mount Everest got a sedimentary rock on top of it? And you realize you have to tell those stories by pulling in different aspects of geology. You've got to talk about the geophysics for the earthquakes, or the geochemistry for this, or the sedimentology for this. And so that's how I started teaching the class. And finally, I just said, well, there ought to be a book like this. And I said, well, okay, I'll write it. But then after a while, I realized that I'll write it is a bit ambitious. It's better to have a co-author to make sure the book gets finished, as well as to bring in different perspectives. So Janok and I started working on this about 8 years ago. I had gotten the idea to do something like this about, 5 or 6 years after I had started teaching the class. And then a few years it had to bubble around, and we're finally ready to hold a book in our hand.
Great, thanks, Pete. You obviously have a really clear vision for the book, and I think that's really reflected in the finished product. Janok, is there anything else you want to say on that, or did you have the same inspiration?
Same inspiration, and I think one of the things that both Pete and I felt, having taught historical geology, is, at U of H, we'd have 1,000 students taking physical and 100 taking historical, and I just went, historical's as, or if not more interesting. Why are we not teaching these great stories to a broader swath of students? And that's because physical is a prerequisite for historical, and most of the students who take historical are sort of committed to being earth science majors. And we really wanted this book to appeal to a much broader audience, which is why we've tried to write a book that is self-explanatory, so it doesn't require physical as a prerequisite, so students can get access to these great stories of evolution, the amazing and crazy things that have happened to planet Earth, like when it froze to death 600 million years ago during the Cryogenian period, or the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, and all these great stories that aren't typically covered in physical geology. And as a consequence, students don't get exposed to those stories if they don't take this class.
Thanks, Janok. I think it'd be interesting to learn a little bit more about your teaching experience, which will clearly have shaped the book. Janok, can you tell us a little bit more about the Earth history courses you've taught, how long you've taught them, what the key challenges you've come up against, and what skills you want students to come away with after the course?
Well, I'll start off by saying I'm a senior citizen this year. When I was 21 as a young geologist, I started reading the amazing books by Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard University, and they just completely transformed the way I thought about geology and Earth history. And that was long before I'd even done a PhD. But when I left the oil business and went to academia, my passion was to do what Gould did. He had this vibrant style of teaching that just made things so engaging. And so I always had this vision of standing on the desk, screaming these great stories at students and getting them motivated. Of course, the very first class I taught was quite small. I remember there was some students taking for elective, and I gave them the study guide, and they said, this is a first year course, right? These questions are really hard. So it's not that I had to dumb it down, but I thought, well, maybe I'm expecting too much. So as always with teaching, you sort of adjust the classes as you go, and then you get busy with research and other things. So I'm not sure I ever really taught the course exactly how I wanted it to. And again, as I was always stymied by these books that it's not that they weren't good, but they were highly technical, and I felt like they were geared towards people that were majoring in geology as opposed to books written to enthuse people. So, for example, in a lot of the textbooks, Snowball Earth is a little box. It's like an aside, sort of a triviality, whereas we think it's one of the most amazing stories in Earth history, about which an entire new geological period has been named the Cryogenian, which means the time of frozen Earth. And it was very controversial when the story came out. It's amazing that life actually managed to make it through that horrific freeze, and we have that chapter up center as a full-fledged story, as opposed to a little box on the side. And let's get on to explaining, the different kinds of brachiopods and some of the other sort of details that we find slow the reader down in some of the other textbooks. And then in terms of skills, we really want this. We want the students to get an idea of all the bits and pieces of types of data and disciplines and detective work that's required to tell these stories. It isn't just telling the stories. It's like, well, it requires some geophysics, it requires some geochemistry, it requires all these fields. And Pete and I are expert in some of them, but we really want to give students a flavor for both the people who develop these great ideas and discover these great stories, and the skill sets that are required, that illustrates the highly integrative nature of this discipline of geology.
Thanks, Janok. Pete, is there anything you want to add from your teaching experience?
Just that, their students really need to have it told to them often that, geology is this integration of stuff. I was thinking as Janok was talking about how often I have to, I'll ask a question, how do we know this? And throughout the semester, I always kind of look at them and I say, if you don't know the answer, just say paleomagnetism. Because that's usually a pretty good place to start, and it's valuable in many different ways. So the approach of my class over the years, and the approach of this book, has always been to sort of make it clear that it's usually not just one thing.
Thanks, Pete. You both talked a little bit already about the existing textbooks and why you felt compelled to write a new one. Pete, could you explain exactly how your book is different and why you've designed it that way?
Well, again, I came up with the idea to do this because I found that although I had a textbook assigned to us and all the students had it, I found that over the years I kept talking about something else. And that was just my style. But I mean, I think we've developed a book from that might be good for a lot of people. And the idea is to make each chapter its own story, or at least the chapters after, say, chapter 6 or, certainly by chapter 8, we've got individual stories. The first few chapters are a little bit more introductory. We have some discussion of how we know how old rocks are. We have a discussion of the early part of the solar system, a lot of things that sort of lay a foundation. But in the last 2/3 of the book, we have individual stories which can be taught by themselves. And it's not a sort of necessity that each chapter be taught in any particular order or that one follows from the other, because it's the idea, again, if somebody comes up to you on the street or at a party or something and says, tell me about this thing. Well, you can tell them about this thing involving the paleomagnetism or the geochemistry or the stratigraphy. And we felt like rather than having individual stories was the best way to describe, how geologists think about things, and it might help instructors. But I think that's what's different about this book. It's what inspired me to move towards to write the book, because that wasn't the way the other books were presenting things.
Thanks, Pete. Janok, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I've got a question. Which chapter is the most difficult to develop? And I'll say chapter 1. That was one of the first chapters we wrote. And most Earth history textbooks start off with many chapters, a chapter on stratigraphy and sedimentation and biostratigraphy. So they sort of lay the foundation of the disciplines of geology not typically covered in physical. And we tried writing chapter 1 like that, and it didn't work. So finally we said, wait a minute, why don't we just do a virtual field trip to the Grand Canyon and just explain to students, as though they were tourists there, well, what's at the base? Oh, there's metamorphic igneous rocks down there, and they're really old. And then they're overlain by sedimentary rocks. And then, so we introduced the basic concepts of stratigraphy, of how you determine the age and order of historical events in Earth history, looking at the geological record, but using the Grand Canyon as sort of a field trip. So the idea is to start the narrative right away. Now, whether we succeeded in chapter 1, not that the reader will have to decide, but that was a chapter we literally wrote. And then 7 years later, we just threw it away and almost started from scratch again, and ended up with a much shorter chapter that we feel covers the basic aspects of geology that you would need to know to understand anything else in the book. And yet it's done more or less through the lens of the Grand Canyon as a narrative way of teaching the basics of geology, as opposed to just a mineral is defined as this, a mineral builds, the more systematic series of lists that tends to be the style used in many other books. And I think ours differs in that way. And then another thing, one of my favorite chapters to write was chapter, 10. And, most Earth history textbooks have a systematic explanation of all the mountain building events on the east coast of North America that built the Appalachians. It's the tectonic orogeny, and it's sort of a step-by-step process. I said, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way to tell that story. And I spent most of my childhood and university education in Newfoundland, and that was the province where, during the beginning of plate tectonics, some of the oldest oceans now destroyed were discovered in the rocks in central Newfoundland. And I thought, well, what a great story, the story of the discovery of this ancient ocean that was squeezed and closed, leaving bits and pieces and remnants, in central Newfoundland. And so I sort of wrote the story of the Appalachian origin as a detective story, using some of the professors that taught me, and the great Tuzo Wilson at Toronto, who taught Harold Williams, who taught me. And so try to tell that story from the point of view of the people and narrative. You still get the same story you get in all the other textbooks. We still discuss all the different orogenic events, but we do it with sort of more of a discovery and narrative style, as opposed to just, here's the mountain building events, they occurred in this order, this one came first, that came second. As Pete said, more sort of just a list of events, which we don't think engages anybody.
That sounds like
one thing I'm reminded of is Janok's talking about chapter 10. We try it in that chapter, and in many other chapters, we really try to point out that geology is figured out by people. And we talk about who those people were and how they had to go back and forth on things. And we try to highlight, the important historical figures in various ideas. Because, just saying that, this is the way it is, makes it sound much easier than it was. And we want to make sure that people understand that there's a lot of work going into it. One thing I always do is when I show these big maps of something in my class, I always point out, where did this come from? Well, it came from, dozens of graduate students coming together and doing this and this and this, and then somebody putting it all together. So we talk about the personal aspect, or the aspect that people are involved, and we really try and talk about some of the key figures who are involved in each of these stories that we tell.
I think that's a really interesting way of framing it, and I'm sure it'd be really inspiring to students as well to hear about the personal stories. So you've explained already that the book focuses on some key events in Earth history. Janok, can you give us some examples of the events that you've highlighted in the book and tell us a bit more about why you selected them?
Some of them were pretty obvious. Obviously, the bulk of the history of the Earth is in the so-called Precambrian, and the event that really struck me as interesting was snowball Earth, and that's a fairly, that hypothesis was really came to the fore. It kind of, I want to say, the late 90s. It was sort of popularized by Paul Hoffman at Harvard University, who was very kind enough to review that chapter for us. And I think his review was longer than the chapter. But that was a story that struck me as really interesting. And of course, the idea that the Earth had frozen was an old one. But every time people proposed it for other times in Earth history, it had been debunked. So, for example, people thought, oh, the Earth froze at the end of the Paleozoic. Well, no, it didn't. Although those glacial deposits were at the equator, we now realize that they were at the South Pole because of plate tectonics. So plate tectonics blew away the notion that the Earth froze. So when it was suggested the Earth really did freeze in the late Neoproterozoic, oh, that just tectonics, yeah, that's based on fuzzy, and there were very few papers when that hypothesis came out. Now, of course, there's thousands and thousands, so that story has matured. Another story that struck me as fascinating was, and I remember reading Ken Siu's book on discovering river gravels at the base of the Mediterranean, and gypsum was an evaporite, and this notion that the entire Mediterranean Ocean just evaporated struck me as the most amazing story, and just the vision of seeing a canyon 1,000 times bigger than the Grand Canyon that existed just a few million years ago sounded like a great story. And again, tends to be sort of a little box in all the other Earth history textbooks. We tell that entire story, how it was discovered, what the consequences are. Of course, some of the stories, again, were we felt we had to write. So one of the very first stories we wrote was the extinction of the dinosaurs, which of course never went extinct because the avian dinosaurs, a bird, is still with us. But there were so many competing theories for how the dinosaurs died, but eventually the discovery of the iridium layer that implied a meteorite had hit the Earth, and then actually discovering and drilling the crater, which has happened really in the past decade or so. We finally drilled the impact crater and found 1,000-foot thick graded bed that was produced when the water that was blown out by the meteor flowed back into that big hole, that gaping 10-kilometer hole in the Earth's crust, right? So some of those stories are pretty amazing, and we certainly enjoyed writing those. And there were others where, because we felt that we had to cover, we do have to cover all the important events in Earth history. And so sometimes we sort of felt, well, we have to cover that, and so some of the chapters, I think maybe, we had to work a little bit hard to find the hook. Some of them were a little bit easier, but certainly some of the events were obviously human history was an obvious one. You've got to talk about the origin of humans. And so I quite enjoyed that chapter and delve into some of the biases and the Piltdown controversy that was sort of embraced because of the desire for white folks to not have humans evolve in Africa, hoping that it occurred in Europe. And of course, the debunking of that forgery was a nice story to tell, and was something I'd read in a Stephen Jay Gould book decades ago. So some of his stories ended up becoming my stories as well.
Thanks, Janok. And it looks to me like you've got a really good spread of events across the whole of Earth history as well, and also in terms of geographical location. I think you've got a really nice, diverse spread as well there. Pete, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I'll just highlight some of those other points. You know, we cover the Himalayas because it's a pretty significant tectonic story and one which illustrates things that a lot of people want to talk about. We talk about the growth of the Himalayas, and that's a thing. We have a chapter on the tectonic evolution of Western North America from about 100 million years to the present. And that's a very good example of integrating various different things together. You've got magmatism and deformation and stratigraphy. We've got, well, Janok's mentioned most of the others. One kind of story, it's not so much a geological story as the story of geology, is what we have in chapter 2, which is a discussion of the various important early players in geology and their early philosophies, and really how it all came to be that we have this thing called the science of geology. So I very much enjoyed putting that together, and I think it really helps students get a sense for how it started. You know, when we talk about the unconformity at Sicker Point that is, you know, the most famous geologic outcrop perhaps, and I always just love telling the students about how it was later written that you know, when they saw that unconformity, they grew giddy, staring into the abyss of time. So those sorts of ways of bringing students into the thought process of geologists, both now and hundreds of years ago, was, I think, important.
Yeah, I think that really brings the subject to life as well. So I think you've given us a really clear picture now of your overall aim of the book and the content and your inspiration behind it. Now let's dive into the features of your textbook. Pete, can you tell us a bit about what readers will find in your book? What are the key features and how will they help instructors and students?
Well, again, it's the narrative nature of things, is that we try to have each story, you know, sort of fit together. We think that the illustrations do a good job. We did most of the illustrations ourselves. And when I say we, I mean Janok. He did a lot more of the illustrations than I did. We also include that for the paleogeographic maps, we have the Ron Blakey approach, which was good. We could get from them and didn't have to do it ourselves, but it's a well-known set of maps that we use to illustrate what things looked like in the past. We think those come together in a pretty coherent whole. We've also put together for instructors, there's a set of PowerPoints which were built off of my PowerPoints, having taught the class for 19 years, which we then, you know, tweaked specifically for our book. We've got test questions for the instructors. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and I know you've also signposted readers through your text using learning objectives at the
We have
beginning
learning
of
objectives,
chapters,
you know,
and
maybe
review
half a dozen
questions.
little bullet points in each
Yeah.
chapter to help the readers go through and really, you know, find those key points.
And you've also, I know, included some really nice focus boxes for more information on certain topics, haven't you? And then also some very small key point boxes just to really reinforce the main points, which I think is a really nice feature.
And for folks who are interested, we've got further reading in the back of each chapter. And we've also developed a online resource of videos that people want to go to, just various, you know, not our videos, but just various things that might be useful for each chapter.
And just to note as well that the figures for the book are already up on the website, and we'll be adding all of the rest of the resources over the next few weeks. So they'll be coming soon. Janok, is there anything else you wanted to say on that, or has Pete covered the main features?
Just a couple of things. I remember, you know, when we began the process, you, CUP, were very adamant that the book be less than 400 pages and the cost be less than $100, I guess, US. So I have noticed that it's $79.99 US on the web, which is, depending on the Canadian dollar, about $100. So we managed to get that. And I remember, you know, we just started writing, and then you said, well, wait a minute, we probably need key points, bullet points, you know, learning objectives, a summary, as well as sort of essay type questions at the end. And so and we felt, we're trying to keep the words down, but we need to reinforce, tell them what you're going to tell them little key points to highlight the important point, and then a summary. So we do have information repeated, which should tell the students this is the information we think is important. In the end, I think the book is better for it, and it forced us to focus. And then when we were putting the PowerPoints together, Pete said, oh, I'm putting the key points in. So a bunch of slides, the key point. And so we're like, okay, it hangs together, and also as we and something that, the people out there may not know is, we just like computer software, we kept version 1, version 2, version 3. Many of the chapters got up to version 30, which meant that we wrote that chapter 30 times or more. And of course, that's a lot of honing. And but in the end, the format, the objectives, the key points, the summary, all that helped make the chapters very clear, very thorough. And we said, wait a minute, why is that in there if it's not a key point? If that's not part of a learning objective, why? So it allowed us to get rid of stuff that we felt was superfluous and make sure that we focus the book in a way that leads the student through and doesn't result in a lot of superfluous information that they go, well, am I going to be tested on that? Well, no, probably not. That's not part of the key point.
Thanks, Janok. Yeah, I agree. I think all of those additional resources you're providing online and all of the extra features that you've added through the book through those 30 iterations of each chapter, I think they've really, really helped to signpost readers carefully through the chapter and to reinforce all the main points, and also to help instructors as well to teach their courses. So I just have a couple of questions now about your own fields of research. Something that I think comes across really clearly in the book is how many different types of scientific evidence are needed to build up a complete understanding of each event in Earth history. And you discuss lots of subdisciplines, from paleontology to structural geology to geochemistry and petrology. Can I ask how you both got into the field and what aspects of it you find most interesting? Pete, would you like to go first?
Into the field of geology?
Yeah, absolutely. And the particular subdisciplines that you're working in.
Well, I guess I got into geology when I was an undergraduate at University of Kansas, and I wanted to be a computer science major, and I took a computer science course, and then that got that out of me. And I was sitting around in the Christmas of my freshman year wondering what I was going to do, and I found out there was this thing called engineering geology. So I took some courses in engineering, and I took some courses in geology, and I very quickly decided that those geologists were the guys I wanted to hang out with. And it was only later that I decided that studying rocks itself was pretty cool. And so I, learned geology at the University of Kansas. And that's where I at the time didn't appreciate, stratigraphy in the way that I learned. When I was an undergraduate, I thought that igneous rocks were just about the coolest thing, and how come I couldn't live near where there were igneous rocks? But because I grew up in Kansas and got my understanding of geology in Kansas, it helps me to think about those things now. What I ended up doing, for my master's and PhD was generally geochemistry. And the geochemistry associated with tectonics, and particularly geochemistry involved with geochronology. And geochronologists have the advantage of being able to give timing to things, and so a lot of people want to collaborate with those sorts of folks. So that's how I started working with stratigraphers and structural geologists, and learning how what I did relates to them, which made it easier to talk about things that are a little outside what I had originally done. And working with lots of people like Mike Murphy and Tim Lawton and Jay Quaid, who are interested in lots of different things, has helped me become a fuller geologist, and perhaps some of that shows up in our book.
Thanks, Pete. Janok, how did you get into your field of research?
Well, I was an undergraduate memorial maths and physics major at 16 years old. Bought a drum kit that same year, and took first year geology for non-majors as an elective that I thought would be an easy A. And after a couple of years of university, I was taking more geology classes. Then I switched into music school for a year, and then decided, as much as I had aspirations for being a professional rock drummer, it was never going to happen. Not that I wasn't a pretty good drummer, but I couldn't stand practicing. It was too boring. So I thought, well, geology seemed like the science that I just took to the easiest, and would give me time to play music on the side. So I became a geologist. And when I did my bachelor's thesis, I was very focused on mapping. And so I did a mapping project that involved, the focus was a little bit more on what we call hard rock geology, mapping granites, but there were other rocks in the area. And I did that knowing I was going to go into the oil business, in which I was going to be focused on stratigraphy and sedimentology in the search of resources. So right away, I had sort of research experience with very basic field mapping. And I felt you've got to be able to go out in the field, walk around, and tell a story. That seemed critical to me. And then, of course, I got in the oil business and learned all about stratigraphy and layering, which is what I focused on when I did my PhD. And then, of course, as soon as I became professor, my desire to teach Earth history, and cover everything in geology came to the fore. And I've always been pretty broad in my interests. My technical field is in sedimentology and stratigraphy, particularly with a focus on looking at rivers and deltas. And the oldest river I've ever worked on was, I think, 3.9 billion year old river on Mars. And we do have an image of that in our textbook, implying that there was flowing water on other planets. So that sort of got me a little bit interested in planetary geology. And then some years ago, I was writing a textbook. Sorry, I was writing a book. Sorry, a paper. And I just felt I needed Pete's advice, because it dealt with sedimentation, but also linking that to tectonics. So I said, "Hey, Pete, would you like to be a co-author with me?" And so Pete and I co-wrote the paper together. His buddy Tim Lawton helped. And that was the first time that Pete and I did a project writing together. I think the writing went very well. And Pete said, "I've always gotten along with Janok, but we've actually written a paper together. I think it's got over 100 citations, which is pretty good in geology." And so I think that led Pete to think that we could do the project together. So that's a little bit of the story of becoming a geologist and then becoming interested in being an author.
Yeah, then that's a question that was actually asked in the chat here about how we chose to collaborate. And that's pretty much how it went, is that, I had the idea for the book, and I had talked with some other publishers before this, and they had sort of passed on it. And I was thinking, oh man, this is going to be hard. And then we worked on that project together, Janok and Tim and I thought, that went okay. And so I said, well, I told Janok about the idea, and I was pretty sure that he was going to say no, and then I was going to be off the hook and I didn't have to do it. But he said, no, that sounds interesting. So we went ahead with it.
I can tell you both have a natural love for the subject, and I think your enthusiasm for that really comes across clearly in the book as well. So another short question. You discuss lots of really interesting events in Earth history in the book. Are there any that you both find particularly fascinating, or are there any outstanding questions about events in Earth history that you think are particularly interesting areas of either current or future research? Janok, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, so I'm seeing a question from my former boss, Bob Stern, and he and I had a lot of chats about this very intriguing and rather controversial idea of when did plate tectonics begin. We know that Earth is the only planet in the solar system with many plates, all the other planets that have tectonics a single lid. And it's, the arguments are technical. It's a very, very, very recent debate. And I've been to some scientific sessions and seen some great talks. It's not, I don't think it's resolved. So we in the chapter on plate tectonics, we end by saying this is a big question and controversy in our science. And again, one of the things I love about geology is that unlike, say, differential calculus, you can get to the absolute forefront, immediate, big questions in our science in first year. You can talk about the controversy of when plate tectonics began in a first year class without the students needing to know all the complex details of plate tectonics. Again, Snowball Earth was quite controversial and very new. And so one of the exciting things was to be able to bring these controversial topics to the fore, and I'm not a big fan of, well, we present the evidence, let the students decide, because they don't necessarily have the training. But I think it is nice that we're able to sort of highlight some of the big questions in our science that are ongoing. And of course, as those controversies get resolved in the next, well, depending on next decade or so, that'll give the opportunities for Pete and I to do an update at some point, right? So I think it is nice that there's, even the story of the demise of the dinosaurs. It's fairly recent. I mean, that was even plate tectonics. I mean, plate tectonics is a theory, which means a fully resolved explanation was only really proposed in the late 60s. So, it's in these are great. The great theories of geology, many of them were developed in Pete and our lifetime. And plate tectonics was brand new when Pete and I were undergraduates, right? Now we're able to go to secondary questions such as, when did plate tectonics begin? And that's sort of the second phase of questions, as opposed to, are there things called plates? And again, in chapter 10, when I was an undergraduate, there were still people that thought maybe the Earth was smaller and expanded over time. So people began to believe continental drift. But until we understood that you could destroy oceans and subductions, the idea was, well, maybe all of the oceans are young and there simply weren't oceans, before Pangea. And we explained in chapter 10 how that hypothesis was fully debunked by looking at the geology of Newfoundland, discovery of ophiolites, and other evidence globally. But Newfoundland was a core place that debunked the expanding Earth theory. And the library memorial was named after Anton Bruckner, who was a retired professor when I was a student, and he believed in the expanding Earth theory. So it really, these theories were expanded by people that I knew and worked with, right, when I was a very young geologist. So seeing those controversies resolved is quite exciting.
One of the things I try to tell my students about that, when we talk about ideas that are new, I tell them about when I was an undergraduate, I took a class in stratigraphy, and our stratigraphy professor, who was pretty old, I think he had gotten his education before World War II, and he was an old guy, and he started the class, and this would be 1978, 79. He walked in and he said, okay, you've probably heard about this thing called plate tectonics. Today is the last day we will discuss this in my class. So I got that sort of feeling at the beginning. I was in that time when it was really, there were people who were still fighting it out. The other thing that came to mind as Janok was talking about is that one of the things that helps me know what's good to put in a book is from the students' questions. Whenever a student asks a question where I have to say, well, we're still working on that. That has to be put in the book as best we can, and we try to explain that these are ideas that we haven't sorted out yet, and we're not finished yet.
Thanks, Pete and Janok. It's amazing just how much our knowledge has grown just even in the last couple of decades, isn't it? And I think that's something that really comes across nicely in the stories that you've told. So I think you've done a really good job of outlining the book and the content and the resources that come with the book. I think now it would be a good time to hand over to the floor for any questions that people in the audience have. Heather, are there any questions?
Before we do that, I noticed there's a question here in the chat that maybe I could discuss from Nikos asked, is there a discussion of catastrophism versus uniformitarianism? Yes, there is. That's chapter 2. We talk about catastrophism. We talk about Plutonism and Neptunism. And then we finish the chapter talking about the problem that we had in the 19th century where people were trying to push away catastrophism, were trying to say uniformitarianism is the only way to go. But then comes along this channeled Scablands showing that, we have to understand that uniformitarianism of process is one thing, but uniformitarianism of rates is something that you have to throw away. So we have chapter 2 is very much about that idea and how it changed people's view of things. Bob asked, do we have any links? Does the book have links to videos? That is an online resource. The actual chapter in the book doesn't do that, but it's all available online.
That will be posted in the next few weeks, I believe. It's not quite up yet, but the online resources will be coming soon.
So what I did is I literally scoured the web and sat watching hours and hours of videos to try to find videos that I felt well illustrated. I mean, one of the struggles with plate tectonics when you read the chapter is it's nice to be able to see animations of the movements of plates. And so we've got links to videos that I thought showed those quite well. So we do have links to the videos, they're not ours. Another question from Juan Sui, if used as a textbook, how much time or how many lectures do you anticipate to devote to the book? So again, Pete and I have taught this class many times. I will be teaching the class again this fall because I want to teach it with the book done. And the way it works is, so historically, I've taught this as a 2 hour a week lecture class, and I can get through the whole book with ease. The difficulty for me is that it's, for us, the course is taught as a second year, and so it partly requires a stratigraphy requirement. So I have to put a lot of stratigraphy in it that's not in the book because, that would be more linked to a more advanced course, and it serves as a requirement for professional certification as a geologist in Ontario. So I have to put in information in the book that's a bit more skills and lab focused, that's a little bit ancillary to the way that we write the book.
I can say that I teach the book pretty much straight on nowadays.
Yeah.
My course is 2 80-minute lectures per week, 16 weeks in the semester, and I pretty much cover the whole book. The book's 19 chapters, and that allows me to go. Some chapters I go through in 2 lectures. Some chapters I'll go through in 4 lectures if I like to slow down and students ask a lot of questions. So it's designed to be a book that can cover pretty much a regular semester.
And then we have a question: if you could witness one moment in Earth's history, what could it be and why? Boy, I'm in all of them, and I would love to stand at the edge of the Mediterranean and see that vast canyon with animals exchanging between Africa and Europe. One of the amazing things is that the African megafauna migrated across the Mediterranean, but when the Zanclean flood occurred, there were elephants on Malta, Sicily that were isolated, and they had a choice: go extinct or evolve to these tiny miniature elephants through a process called insular dwarfism that illustrates the concept of allopatric speciation that we talk about in chapter 6 on evolution. So, just seeing some of those stunningly crazy landscapes from the past would be something that would be invaluable. One of the reasons we chose Ron Blakey's reconstructions that is he does textured, sort of as though you were taking a photograph of the Earth via satellite. So his images give us a feel for what the landscape really looked like in those times in ancient history. So, and of course, I wouldn't want to be there the day that the asteroid hit the Earth, but maybe a few months after the explosion, just to witness that devastation. There's a movie called The Road, based on a book by Cormac McCarthy, about a post-apocalyptic Earth with Viggo Mortensen managing with his son, to getting through North America after a nuclear war. And I suspect that that's what North America would have looked like a few months after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event. So seeing that would be something else.
I think we have another question in the Q&A from Sunny. They said, I'm really looking forward to your new book. I'm just wondering, do the cited examples in the book compare cases from around the world, or are they primarily centered on specific geography?
I'd say it's very variable. I mean, certainly there is a North American focus, but the Out of Africa focuses on human evolution, which fundamentally occurs in Africa. And we're very strong to make that point for reasons that will be obvious if you read the chapter. Pete's had a long interest in the Himalayas. And so we have a whole chapter on the Himalayan orogeny that sort of leaks into the chapter on the Mediterranean, because part of the closing of the Mediterranean and shutting off the connection to the Atlantic is part of that plate tectonic collision, right? That caused bits and pieces of Morocco to raise or lower, and either connected or disconnected the connection of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. There are places where maybe I don't think we say much about Australia, for example, although it was part of Pangaea. So, we aren't able to cover the geology of the whole world. This book is sort of focused on the North American market. So certainly there's probably a bit more focus on North America. And also, perhaps as a Canadian, the Burgess Shale is in Canada, and it's one of the famous Lagerstadt. And of course, we have fantastic collections both at the Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology in Alberta and at the Royal Ontario Museum right here up in Toronto. And so we focus those collections, right? So some of the actual fossil samples and collections we have are photographs that we took at museums. I've made it part of my goal to visit as many natural history museums as I can in the world, and I've got photographs from Calcutta, from the Natural History Museum in London. Houston's got a great natural history museum. We took lots of photographs there. The Perot Museum in Dallas, where I used to live, and other places. So, I go around snapping photographs, and went to the Field Museum in Chicago. I was giving a talk at Northwestern University, and went in to see that fantastic new display of the huge Tyrannosaurus Sioux, and she's in the book. So, so the opportunity to sort of showcase collections from around the world, and try to, really show the students the fossils and the bones as opposed to just a reconstruction. So they know that's the data, and it's hard won. How do you take a bunch of jumbled zones and put it together in an animal that makes sense, right? And then add the blood and flesh to bring reality to it. Part of the problem with today is that there's so many great videos on dinosaurs, people forget that it's based on digging up bones, right? And people may think we've actually got videos of these creatures running about. We don't. It's all hard science and difficult work to put together the lifestyles of these ancient organisms.
Bob asked another question here, which sort of goes back to Sonny's question about the way in which we talk about an individual place. But Bob says that there's a significant overlap between physical geology text in this book, and there's some because we don't want. I've taught physical geology many times. I've taught historical geology many times, and just because they've had physical geology doesn't mean they remember all that stuff. We still have to explain Steno's laws. We still have to explain a lot of stuff. And in the chapter on the Himalayas, I stopped and I said, okay, we need to talk about metamorphism. So we've got a big long box about Barrovian metamorphism as George Barrow discovered it in Scotland. So that's a kind of physical geology primer there that we have to sort of point out. But what we're trying to do in the physical geology portions of the book is always be having that physical geology stuff, which they maybe didn't get or need a review on, to be in service of the particular story. We're talking about the Himalayas. We have to talk about metamorphism. Should there be a single course covering both? I think that maybe that would be an interesting way to go, but we are assuming that this is going to be in the market for what's called historical geology. If somebody wants to change their curriculum and start teaching a single book course, maybe this would be a good place to do that. We understand that most people have a physical geology book and a physical geology course, and we don't go into all the detail that a lot of physical geology books do, but we try and lay down that physical geology, that basic geology knowledge that can get them starting about the story really, really fast. That stuff is in service of the story whenever it can be.
And you've also included a few primer chapters at the beginning of the book, haven't you, for those who maybe have forgotten their physical
as John
geology.
described, is a good way to talk about all these basic concepts. Chapter 2 is the philosophy. Chapter 3 is an understanding of the early solar system and why it is so important to understand meteorites, because we don't have early pieces of the Earth. We have to look at the meteorites. We have to look at the moon to understand the early part on. Chapter 4 is about geochronology and how we understand the ages of things. It also talks about some of the interesting stories about how the way Kelvin estimated the age of the Earth, and then we understood. And then the first age, Kelvin said it's 30 million years old, and then the first age anybody ever got was from uranium helium dating, and they got 30 million years, and all the geologists and all the biologists said, "Oh my God, did Kelvin get it right?" And then we had to understand the concept of closure temperature, that those ages are not the age of the Earth, but the last time the rock was at a certain temperature. So we put these concepts into this historical concern about, Lord Kelvin and his big ideas and his big ego. Chapter 5 is a basic story of plate tectonics. So those are the sort of primer chapters, and then we start telling stories.
Yeah, and I think there's chapters like 6 is the principles of evolution. That's not usually in physical geology. 7 is an entire chapter on the origin of life. That's not usually in physical geology. And then chapter 8 is on snowball Earth. That's usually not in physical geology.
That's when we really start telling individual stories.
Chapter 9 is on the origins of metazones, the Great Ordovician biodiversity event. That's not usually in physical geology. I mean, it is in some of the physical geology books that are so huge that I don't think you could ever get through those books in one semester. Our book is definitely designed as a one semester course with the emphasis on the stories as opposed to, the details of minerals and rocks and crystallography and also a lot of physical geology texts have entire chapters on waves, beaches, rivers, deserts, glaciers. We introduce glaciers as a consequence of snowball Earth. Or in chapter 18, we talk about sea level changes in the Pleistocene. So there is a little bit on glaciers, but it's used in explaining the carving of the northern hemisphere landscape as a result of glacial processes, as opposed to sort of this is how modern glaciers work. So
well, and then we take chapter 18, we talk about the consequences of glaciers for sea level rise, and then Janok gets to talk all about sequences and stratigraphy and how it leads to oil systems and what like that. But these are showing the integration. We start talking about glaciers and we ended up talking about oil systems.
So Bob's also asked another question. Is there a bank of test questions and answers with the book?
Yes.
Yes, there will be, Bob. They're not quite up online yet, but they will be coming in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for those.
And the number of questions per each chapter is really quite extensive. 50, 60 multiple choice questions, as well as each chapter has a series of a half a dozen, more free response sort of questions.
Yeah, and we don't provide answers to those, but I think anyone teaching the book, they're essay type questions. So any professional geologist would more or less know the answers to those questions. But it is just a way of focusing the students on could they answer those questions, and it would give the opportunities for faculty that would like to have more open-ended essay type questions versus the vast number of multiple choice type questions that is mostly what the test banks are. And yeah, can we talk about how we're generating those, or does that matter, Emma?
I don't think it matters.
Oh.
You can if you want to.
Yeah, we do have our own questions that we've used for years, but we are using some of these AI chat GPT programs to generate multiple choice questions. They generate lots of them, like 80 per chapter, and then Pete and I go through those very carefully, and it's amazing how good many of them are. And they also sort of explain whether it's easy, medium, hard, and in terms of Bloom's taxonomy of pedagogy, whether it's testing recall or concepts. And so it's been quite interesting. We don't generate the questions, and sometimes I go like, yeah, I'm not sure I could answer that question, or I don't remember that. So I'm like, well, I don't think that's appropriate, or so we're filtering those to make sure that that we have a wide variety of questions at a variety of levels that faculty could use. And so some faculty might like to ask, quote, harder questions, some more straightforward ones, so others.
The open-ended questions at the end of each chapter are large. When I have taught the class, I don't usually do it multiple choice questions. I have essay questions, and so most of those questions at the back of each chapter are questions that I have asked in my classes.
Fantastic. I don't think I see any more questions in the chat. Heather, is there anything in the Q&A I've missed?
I
yes.
don't think so. Oh, yeah.
There is one more, yes, which we discussed briefly, but maybe you could expand on it a little bit.
Well, we've kind of discussed this already, Omar, what makes it different is I think we try and focus on telling self-contained stories, the story of Snowball Earth, the story of the Burgess Shale, the story of the Himalayas. But in each case, we point out that each of those stories requires, a little bit of this, some geophysics and some geochemistry and some stratigraphy. So I think that that's what we tried to make the book different. It's a story-based approach. That's why it's the stories in our title, Earth History, Stories of Our Geologic Past. I think that a lot of other books feel like they have to talk about a lot of different fossils or a lot of different tectonic types. We talk about all the tectonic types and we talk about some fossils, but in each case, it's about a story.
Yeah, for example, a lot of the historical textbooks will have sort of a chapter on the Cretaceous, and it's got dinosaurs in there, it's got warm seas, and then there might be a little box that talks about the extinction. No, we have a complete separate chapter, Age of Dinosaurs, because we know that, any 18-year-old that's going to read this book is probably going to have had dinosaurs, frenzy as a kid. So we do tell the story of the Cretaceous, but a little bit more from the perspective of dinosaurs. And then we have an entire chapter on the extinction. That's not a little box and a little side. We want that story to be up front and foremost because of all the detective work that was required, the geochemistry in the detection of anomalously high iridium in a layer that could be correlated, then the discovery of the crater itself, and then even more recent work that does modeling of how long the dust was in the air that shut down the photosynthesis, that destroyed all the greenery that the herbivores were eating. So when they all died, the T-Rexes had nothing to eat. And so the only thing that survived were scavengers or things that could eat fungi or insectivores or detritivores. Even in the mammals, the purely carnivorous and herbivorous mammals didn't survive that extinction event. So, we take these little asides and little sort of things that other books tend to, I don't say trivial, but sort of, well, that's kind of an aside that might be no snow. We're like, no, we think that's an essential story that really brings the practice of geology to life.
Yeah, and I think that's what really makes your book so engaging. You still cover all of the essential events and the essential information students need to take away from the course, but you do it in a much more interesting narrative style.
That's our hope.
Fantastic. I think our time is up pretty much. So thank you very much to Pete and Janok. It's been so interesting to hear more about your book and the inspiration behind it. And I think you've given us a really clear outline of the book and the key features of it. And thank you as well so much for all your work on writing the book. I know it's been a labor of love, but we're really looking forward to publishing the book officially on the 1st of May. I can't wait to see a copy of it myself. And we'll have copies of it on display, hopefully at the European Geosciences Union meeting, if we get stock in time, I'm not sure, fingers crossed. But also we should have copies at the Goldschmidt meeting in July, the Geological Society of America GSA meeting in October, and of course AGU4 meeting in December. So if anyone attending is going to any of those meetings, please do come by the Cambridge stand in the exhibit hall and have a look at it yourself. And thanks everyone for coming to the webinar and for your really thoughtful questions. And thanks to Janok and Pete for your insightful answers. I really hope everyone has enjoyed the session. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.